This video is about ethical frameworks. Definitions: ethical, relating to moral principles or the branch of knowledge dealing with ethical issues or ethical standards. Dilemma, a situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between two or more alternatives that are equally desirable or undesirable. He wants to make money, but he also disapproves of it, is an example. Ethical frameworks. An ethical dilemma is one in which a person has to choose between two options, both of which are morally correct, but in conflict. The solutions both deal with the questions of right and wrong. What actions make up ethical behavior is determined by societal or cultural norms, cultural frameworks of a given society or community, in other words. What makes up moral behavior is up to the individual to decide based on their own sense of right and wrong. What is the flaw in this grouping of definitions about ethical frameworks? If your own sense of right and wrong is morally abhorrent to society, but still makes sense to you, it's possible you could make a decision that actually hurts somebody, even though it might be right for you. Kant is a German philosopher who presents the following ethical framework: rule-based thinking, or the categorical imperative as most people refer to it. Ask yourself, if everyone in the world followed the rule of action that I am following, would that create the greatest good, or in Kant's words, the greatest character? The code of ethics. I put in this slide with the picture of a cod because I just like it. Aristotle. His theory of the golden mean, that says moral behavior is the mean between two extremes. At one end is excess, at the other deficiency. Find a moderate position between those two extremes and you will be acting morally. A quote from Aristotle that is relevant to this UF200 course: "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." There's a 16-minute video that is a great TED Talk to consider watching for this module. It's called "We Need a Moral Operating System." In this video, Damon Horowitz reviews the enormous new powers that technology gives to us to know more and more about each other than ever before. Drawing the audience into a philosophical discussion, Horowitz invites us to pay new attention to the basic philosophy, the ethical principles behind the burst of invention remaking our world. Where's the moral operating system that allows us to make sense of it? He spends some time talking about the right to privacy in his video. I'm going to review the 5 ethical frameworks from a framework for thinking ethically. This is the first one. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? This is the question for the utilitarian approach. Utilitarianism is most often associated with the British philosopher John Stuart Mill, who developed the theory from a plain hedonistic version put forward by his mentor, Jeremy Bentham. It is a normative ethical theory that places the locus of right and wrong solely on the outcomes or consequences of choosing one action or policy over other actions or policies. As such, it moves beyond the scope of one's own interests and takes into account the interests of others. At its most basic, it states that something is moral or good when it produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. The question you ask with the rights approach: which option best respects the rights of all who have a stake? That's why we study stakeholders. The rights approach focuses on respect for human dignity. This approach holds that our dignity is based on our ability to choose freely how we will live our lives and what we have a moral right to respect for our choices. And that we have a moral right to respect for our choices as free, equal, and rational people, and a moral duty to respect others in the same way. This moral approach holds that our dignity is based on our ability to choose freely how we live our lives, and that we have a moral right to respect for our choices as free, equal, and rational people, and a moral duty to respect others in the same way. It has its roots in the philosophy of the 18th century thinker Immanuel Kant and others like him, who focused on the individual's right to choose for herself or himself. The third approach: which option best treats people equally or proportionately? This is the justice approach. The principle states, what is ethical is what develops moral virtues in ourselves and our communities. The fairness or justice approach to ethics has its roots in the teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who said that equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally. From the Republic, written by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, to A Theory of Justice, written by the late Harvard philosopher John Rawls, every major work on ethics has held that justice is part of the central core of morality. Which option best serves the community as a whole, not just some members? This is a question for the common good approach, that which benefits society as a whole in contrast to the private good of individuals and sections of society. The notion of the common good has been a consistent theme in Western political philosophy, most notably in the work of Aristotle, Machiavelli, and Rousseau. It has been most clearly developed in the political theory of republicanism, which has contended that the common good is something that can only be achieved through political means and the collective action of citizens participating in their own self-government. Sound like the U.S.? It should. At the same time, the notion of the common good has been closely bound up with the idea of citizenship, a mutual commitment to common goods and the value of political action as public service. In other words, the belief that everyone who lives in a given society is responsible to take political action for the common good. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? This is the virtue approach. Virtue ethics is currently one of the three major approaches in normative ethics. It may initially be identified as the one that emphasizes the virtues or moral character, in contrast to the approach that emphasizes duties or rules, that is, deontology, or that emphasizes the consequences of actions, consequentialism. A virtue is an excellent trait of character. It is a disposition well entrenched in its possessor, something that, as we say, goes all the way down. It is not a habit such as being a tea drinker. And all the way down you notice and expect and value and feel and desire and choose to act and react in certain characteristic ways. Most people who can truly be described as fairly virtuous, and certainly markedly better than those who can be truly described as dishonest, self-centered, and greedy, will still have their blind spots, little areas where they do not act for the reasons one would expect. The ethical frameworks for right versus right include truth versus loyalty, individual versus community, short-term versus long-term, and justice versus mercy. What are some examples of when you would use these? Would you tell your best friend that her boyfriend was trying to date you? That would be the truth. Or are you loyal to what you believe is right for this other person? It can be really complicated. These are the ethical dilemmas that pit two possible correct solutions. You can use ethical frameworks to describe how you might make a decision about taking an action or not acting, to describe how a stakeholder might make a decision about taking an action or not acting. How is making a decision to act or not act related to the cultural frameworks that influence you and/or the various stakeholders? What about using an ethical framework to justify actions or non-actions that oppress an individual or a group of people? Think about Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. What about corporations or governments? Is it possible that they might use an ethical framework to ask for the government to do something that might not be in the best interest of the entire population? Maybe. So what are the possible ethical issues in your career field? If you're an accountant, what kind of issues might you have? If you are somebody who is a personal trainer, what kind of ethical issues might there be? If you're a teacher, what kind of ethical issues might there be? If you look, most types of careers have some ethical boundaries, or at least some ethical frameworks that are guidelines for how to behave ethically in their particular chosen career. There's an upcoming assignment, the Personal Ethical Decision-Making paper. You should complete the readings from this module, Ethical Frameworks, and from the following module, Ethical Decision-Making, before writing this paper.